Protestantism is usually complimented on having brought the mundane into repute again, marriage, the state, etc. But the mundane itself as mundane, the secular, is even more indifferent to it than to Catholicism, which lets the profane world stand, yes, and relishes its pleasures, while the rational, consistent Protestant sets about annihilating the mundane altogether, and that simply by hallowing it. So marriage has been deprived of its naturalness by becoming sacred, not in the sense of the Catholic sacrament, where it only receives its consecration from the Church and so is unholy at bottom, but in the sense of being something sacred in itself to begin with, a sacred relation. Just so the state also, formerly the Pope gave consecration and his blessing to it and its princes. Now the state is intrinsically sacred. Majesty is sacred without needing the priest's blessing. The order of nature, or natural law, was altogether held as God's ordinance. Hence, it is said in the Augsburg Confession, Art 2, so now we reasonably abide by the saying, as the jurisconsults have wisely and rightly said, that man and woman should be with each other is a natural law. Now, if it is a natural law, then it is God's ordinance, therefore implanted in nature, and therefore a divine law also. And is it anything more than Protestantism brought up to date when Feuerbach pronounces moral relations sacred? Not as God's ordinance, indeed, but instead for the sake of the Spirit that dwells in them. But marriage, as a free alliance of love, of course, is sacred of itself by the nature of the union that is formed here. That marriage alone is a religious one, that is a true one, that corresponds to the essence of marriage, love. And so does all moral relations. They are ethical, are cultivated with a moral mind only where they rank as religious of themselves. True friendship is only when the limits of friendship are preserved with religious conscientiousness, with the same conscientiousness with which the believer guards the dignity of his God. Friendship is and must be sacred for you, and property in marriage and the good of every man, but sacred in and of itself. That is a very essential consideration. In Catholicism, the mundane can indeed be consecrated or hallowed, but is not sacred without this priestly blessing. In Protestantism, on the contrary, mundane relations are sacred of themselves, sacred by their mere existence. The Jesuit maxim, the end hallows the means, corresponds precisely to the consecration by which sanctity is bestowed. No means are holy or unholy in themselves, but the relation to the Church, their use for the Church, hallows the means. Regicide was named as such if it was committed for the Church's behoof, if it could be certain of being hallowed by the Church, even if the hallowing was not openly pronounced. To the Protestant, majesty ranks as sacred. To the Catholic, only the majesty which is consecrated by the pontiff can rank as such. And it does rank as such to him only because the Pope, even though it be without a special act, confers this sacredness on it once for all. If he retracted this consecration, the king would be left only a man of the world, or layman, or unconsecrated man to the Catholic. If the Protestant seeks to discover the sacredness in the essential itself, that he may be linked only to what is holy, the Catholic strives rather to banish the sensual from himself into a separate domain, where it, like the rest of nature, keeps its value for itself. The Catholic Church eliminated mundane marriage from its consecrated order and withdrew those who were its own from the mundane family. The Protestant Church declared marriage and family ties to be holy, and therefore not unsuitable for its clergymen. A Jesuit may, as a good Catholic, hallow everything. He needs only to say to himself, I, as a priest, am necessary to the Church, but serve it more zealously when I appease my desires properly. Consequently, I will seduce this girl, have my enemy there poison, etc. My end is holy because it is a priest. Consequently, it hallows the means. For in the end, it is still done for the benefit of the Church. Why should the Catholic priest shrink from handing Emperor Henry VII the poisoned wafer for the Church's welfare? The genuinely churchly Protestants invade against every innocent pleasure because only the sacred, the spiritual, could be innocent. What they could not point out to the Holy Spirit in, the Protestants had to reject. Dancing, theater, ostentation, the church, for instance, and the like. Compared with this puritanical Calvinism, Lutheranism is again more on the religious, spiritual track, is more radical. For the former excludes at once a great number of things essential and worldly, and purifies the church. Lutheranism, on the contrary, tries to bring spirit into all things as far as possible, to recognize the Holy Spirit as an essence in everything, and so to hallow everything worldly. No one can forbid a kiss and honor. The spirit of honor hallows it. Hence it was that the Lutheran Hegel, he calls himself such in some passage or other, he wants to remain a Lutheran, was completely unsuccessful in carrying the idea through everything. In everything there is reason, Holy Spirit, or the real is rational. For the real is in fact everything, and as in each thing, each lie, the truth can be detected. There is no absolute lie, no absolute evil, etc. Great works of mind were created almost solely by Protestants, as they alone were the true disciples and consummators of mind. How little man is able to control. He must let the sun run its course, the sea roll its waves, the mountains rise to heaven. Thus he stands powerless before the uncontrollable. Can he keep off the impression that he is helpless against this gigantic world? It is a fixed law to which he must submit. It determines his fate. Now, what did pre-Christian humanity work toward? Toward getting rid of the eruptions of the destinies, not letting oneself be vexed by them. The Stoics attained this in apathy, declaring the attacks of nature indifferent, and not letting themselves be affected by them. Horace utters the famous nil admire, by which he likewise announces the indifference of the other, the world. It is not to influence us, not to rouse our astonishment, and that impavidum ferient rune expresses the very same imperturbability. As in Psalms 46.3, "Do not fear through the earth should perish." In all this there is room made for the Christian proposition that the world is empty, for the Christian contempt of the world. The imperturbable spirit of the wise man, in which the old worked toward to prepare its end, now underwent an inner perturbation against which no atraxia, no stoic courage was able to protect it. The spirit, secured against all influence of the world, insensible to its shocks and exalted above its attacks, admiring nothing, not to be disconcerted by any downfall of the world, foamed over irrepressibly again, because gases, spirits, were evolved into its own interior, and after the mechanical shock that comes from without had become ineffective chemical tensions that agitate within, began their wonderful play. In fact, ancient history ends with this, that I have struggled till I won my ownership of the world. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, Matthew 11:27. It has ceased to be overpowering, unapproachable, sacred, divine. For me, it is undeified, and now I treat it so entirely as I please that if I cared, I could exert on it all miracle-working power, i.e., the power of mind. Remove mountains, command mulberry trees to tear themselves up and transplant themselves into the sea, and do everything possible, thinkable. All things are possible to him who believes. I am the Lord of the world, mine is the glory. The world has become prosaic, for the divine has vanished from it. It is my property, which I dispose of as I, to wit, the mind, choose. When I had exalted myself to be the owner of the world, egoism had won its first complete victory, had vanquished the world, had become worldless, and put the acquisitions of a long age under lock and key. The first property, the first glory, has been acquired. But the Lord of the world is not yet Lord of his thoughts, his feelings, his will. He is not Lord and owner of the Spirit, for the Spirit is still sacred, the Holy Spirit, and the worldless Christian is not able to become godless. If the ancient struggle was to struggle against the world, the medieval Christian struggle is to struggle against the self, the mind, the former against the outer world, the latter against the inner world. The medieval man is the man whose gaze is turned inward, the thinking, meditative. All wisdom of the ancients is the science of the world. All wisdom of the moderns is the science of God. The heathen, Jews included, go through with the world, but now the thing was going through with self, the spirit too, i.e., become spiritless or godless. For almost 2,000 years, we have been working at subjecting the Holy Spirit to ourselves, and little by little we have torn off and trodden underfoot many bits of sacredness. But the gigantic opponent is constantly rising anew, under changed form and name. The Spirit has not yet lost its divinity, its holiness, its sacredness. To be sure, it has long ceased to flutter over our heads as a dove. To be sure, it no longer gladdens its saints alone, but lets itself be caught by the laity too. But as Spirit of humanity, as Spirit of man, it still remains an alien spirit to me or you, still far from becoming our unrestricted property, which we dispose of at our pleasure. However, one thing certainly happened, and visibly guided by the progress of post-Christian history, this one thing was the endeavor to make the Holy Spirit more human, and it nearer to men or men to it, though this it came about that at last it could be conceived as the spirit of humanity, and under different expressions like the idea of humanity, mankind, humaneness, general philanthropy, appeared more attractive, more familiar, and more accessible. Will not one think that now everybody could possess the Holy Spirit, take up to himself the idea of humanity, bring mankind to form an existence in himself? No. The Spirit is not stripped of its holiness, robbed of its unapproachableness, is not accessible to us, not our property. For the spirit of humanity is not my spirit. My ideal it may be, and as a thought I call it mine. The thought of humanity is my property, and I prove this sufficiently by propounding it quite according to my views, and shaping it today so, tomorrow otherwise. We represent it to ourselves in most manifold ways, but it is at the same time an entail which I cannot alienate nor get rid of. Among many transformations, the Holy Spirit became in the time the absolute idea, which again in manifold reflections split into the different ideas of philanthropy, reasonableness, civic virtue, etc. But can I call the idea my property if it is the idea of humanity? And can I consider the Spirit as vanquished if I am to serve it, sacrifice myself to it? Antiquity, at its close, has gained its ownership of the world only when it had broken the world's overpoweringness and divinity, recognized the world's powerlessness and vanity. The case with regard to the Spirit corresponds when I have disregarded it to a spook and its control over me to a cranky notion, and it is to be looked upon as having lost its sacredness, its holiness, its divinity, and then I use it, as one uses nature at pleasure without scruple. The nature of the case, the concept of the relationship, is to guide me in dealing with the case or in contracting the relation, as if a concept of the case existed on its own account. It was not rather the concept that one forms of the case, as if a relation which we enter was not, by the uniqueness of those who enter into it, itself unique, as if it depended on how others stamp it. But as people separated the essence of man from the real man, and judged the latter by the former, so they also separate his action from him, and appraise it by human value. Concepts are to decide everywhere, concepts to regulate life, concepts to rule. This is the religious world, to which Hegel gives a systematic expression, bringing method into the nonsense and completing the conceptual precepts into rounded, firmly based dogmatic. Everything is sung according to concepts. The real man, I am compelled to live according to these conceptual laws. Can there be more grievous dominion of law, and did not Christianity confess at the very beginning that it meant only to draw Judaism's dominion of law tighter? Liberalism simply brought other concepts on the carpet. Human instead of divine, political instead of ecclesiastical, scientific instead of doctrinal, and more generally, real concepts and eternal laws instead of crude dogmas and precepts. Now nothing but mind rules in the world. An innumerable multitude of concepts buzz about in people's heads, and what are those doing who endeavor to get further? They are negating these concepts to put new ones in their place. They are saying, you form a false concept of right, of the state, of man, of liberty, of truth, of marriage, etc. The concept of right, etc. is rather that one which we shall now set up. Thus the confession of concept moves forward. The history of the world has dealt cruelly with us, and the Spirit has obtained an almighty power. You must have regard for my miserable shoes, which could protect your naked foot, my salt, by which your potatoes would become palatable, and my state carriage, and whose possession would relieve you of all need at once. You must not reach out after them. Man is to recognize the independence of all these, and innumerable other things. They are to rank in his mind as something that cannot be seized or approached, are to be kept away from him. He must have regard for it, respect it. Woe to him if he stretches out his fingers desirously. We call that being light-fingered. How beggarly little is left us. Yes, how really nothing. Everything has been removed. We must not venture on anything unless it is given to us. We continue to live only by the grace of the giver. You must not pick up a pin, unless indeed you have got leave to do so. And got it from whom? From respect. Only when this lets you have it as property, only when you can respect it as property, only then may you take it. And again, you're not to conceive a thought, speak a syllable, commit an action that should have their warrant in you alone, instead of receiving it from morality or reason or humanity. Happy unconstraint of the desirous man, how mercilessly people have tried to slay you on the altar of constraint. But around the altar rise the arches of a church, and its walls keep moving further and further out. What they enclose is sacred. You can no longer get to it, no longer touch it. Shrieking with the hunger that devours you, you wander around these walls in search of the little that is profane, and the circles of your course keep growing more and more extended. Soon the church will embrace the world, and you will be driven out to the extreme edge. Another step, and the world of the sacred has conquered. You sink into the abyss. Therefore, take courage while it is yet time. Wander about no longer in the profane, where now it is dry feeding. Dare the leap, and rush in through the gates into the sanctuary itself. If you devour the sacred, you have made it your own. Digest the sacramental wafer, and you get rid of it.